Good morning. It's great to be back here with all of you. I think the last time I was here, what did I speak about? Does anyone remember?
The news.
The news. Yeah. The news. And about a year and a half ago, I gave a talk here called Women, Love, and Power that looked at the divine feminine and a new way of perceiving power in the world. Today, I want to look at what you might call the flip side of that. A new way to perceive masculinity in the world. It's particularly relevant right now in our country as we seem to be debating what it means in modern America to be a man. We live in a time of rapidly shifting gender roles and a grand reimagination of God in places like Unity. Here we see God as a power and presence. And you might say that in Unity, God's pronouns are he, she, and it. After all, if we are created in God's likeness, it follows that God is not limited to any gender, but is all of us in all of our gendered and non-gendered beauty. So it might seem odd in Unity to have a talk focused on God the Father, which feels, even to me, a little bit traditional, perhaps old-fashioned. You might think of the Sistine Chapel, the old man with the gray beard in the sky, giving life to Adam. But one of the things I love about Unity is that we revitalize traditional concepts and words, Scripture, and the meaning of Jesus' time here on earth and beyond. We don't throw it all out. We look at it in new ways, thereby allowing us to see deeper meanings within ancient concepts, meanings hiding in plain sight. There's great value, I think, in reinvigorating sometimes stale and rigid spiritual concepts, breathing life back into them for our modern ears and for our living experience. So today, I will be shining a spotlight on the language of God the Father. As we move toward an understanding of God beyond such words, it can be helpful right now to meet ourselves where we are and as a culture and to nudge us forward. And God the Father is still pretty much the dominant concept out there. So let's look at first fatherhood as an institution. Today, that institution is changing rapidly, what it means. And right now, it seems to often be on shaky ground. According to a 2022 study, while just 6% of respondents reported estrangement from their mothers, an astonishing 26% of respondents reported estrangement from their fathers, over 4 times as many. According to the most recent U.S. Census, 1 in 4 children live without a father in this country. And the average school-age boy only spends about 30 minutes per week in one-on-one conversations with his father. For comparison, the same boy on average will spend more than 40 hours per week watching television, playing video games, and surfing the internet. And they say for teenagers, it's probably more than 60 hours per week. Compare those two. So what's going on with fathers, and really what's going on with men, especially in this country? In her brand new book, Boy Mom, Ruth Whipman says there is a yearning in boys and men for emotional connections, intimacy, and deep friendships, but no idea how to get them. There are virtually no stories for boys where relationship is the primary focus. Instead, we get adventures, problem solving, conquering, etc. So boys are taught never to discuss feelings or personal struggles, but rather sports, favorite movies, politics, or facts. We are taught to devalue intimacy. We reinforce this in subtle ways. Whipman points out that when she dropped her boy off for the first day of kindergarten, the male teacher greeted each girl with, "Hi, sweetheart," and each boy with, "Hey, buddy." An octave down and a fist bump, right? Consider the difference between those two greetings and what they imply to a kindergartner. Apparently, at least unconsciously, we don't want to associate boys with sweetness or hearts. A buddy is someone you pal around with. A sweetheart is someone intimate. You have to be carefully taught, and it starts early. She points out that, quote, most popular feminist writing has focused heavily on how boys and men benefit from patriarchy, but less on how they are harmed by it. What they lose in terms of care and nurturing, emotion and connection. Of course, she says, in order to register this as an actual loss, we need to truly believe that these things are worth having in the first place, to value emotional intimacy, not as a nice-to-have add-on or fine for girls, but as something weighty and significant enough to be seen as aspirational for boys and men. This would require attaching real importance to the behavior and cultural norms of women. She continues, the logic easily starts to collapse in on itself. As a society, we tend to assign a higher cultural value to male concerns and trivialize those associated with girls and women. This gendered hierarchy means, in turn, that we tend to overvalue power and undervalue intimacy and the expression of emotions. Girl power is an aspirational slogan. It's hard to imagine much demand for boy nurture t-shirts. End quote. Now, I found all of that profound and, I have to say, extraordinarily sad. 79% of suicides in this country are men. And I could give you similarly alarming statistics on rates of depression, drug use, dropping out of school, et cetera, et cetera. We are suffering as a country and as a species because of male misery. And the lack of emotional intelligence only makes it worse. So maybe, rather than focusing on smashing the patriarchy, Whitman suggests, we might want to focus on what men could gain in this cultural shift. She says it's an opportunity to become more fully human, and I agree. This past week, we saw 17-year-old Gus Walls openly bawling and pointing toward the stage saying, "That's my dad." And this led to a lot of debate. But I found one really insightful take on this episode on Facebook, of all places. This is also what dismantling the patriarchy looks like. Creating safe and nurturing spaces for boys to cry, to feel and express love, to not only witness it, but also celebrate it. Right. This shift, and I wouldn't say dismantle the patriarchy, I would say this cultural shift toward expanding our humanity as men, as everyone. To be all that we could be, as the army used to tell us. Or in Jesus' words, to have life and have it abundantly. And I have to thank my enlightened mother for bringing me and my brothers up with a celebration of that full emotional palette. And I am quite fortunate, I realize now, and grateful to my mother, that I grew up with two fathers, not at the same time. The first, my biological father, and later a second father. My first father grew up in the 40s and 50s, in a time when men in this country were very traditional and were expected to provide for the family, period. Now, he certainly rebelled against many of the norms of his time, but he admitted later, many years later, after I'd done lots of therapy and softened toward him, that he wished he'd been more present for me and my brothers when we were growing up, but that in his time, a man was expected to just work. And he did. He was a doctor, often on call or away at medical conferences. So that meant that our family time was precious to me. Beach hikes, or Sunday waffles, or meetings for worship at the Quaker meeting in Seattle. He provided for us, and I am truly and eternally grateful for that, as I now know many people who did not have that or anything close to it. But as he acknowledged, he was not as present. When I was 9, my parents got divorced, and as heartbreaking as that was for me and for all of us, I could see later that it was necessary. Still, it took a while for me to heal, to not blame him or resent him, and to love those parts of me that are like him. Remember, love your enemies means internal ones as well. Those shadow parts of ourselves that we have disowned. I might say to myself, I better not be like Dad. Unconsciously pushing those parts down. Now, when I was 13, I got a second father who was and is very different. He spent quality time with each boy every day, doing what we chose. Not 30 minutes a week, an hour a day. He was present and loving and funny and strong and also sensitive, and only now do I appreciate what a wonderful father he was and is. It was confusing at times, having two dads, but the emotional security I now received was like nutritious soil. You may not realize until later how vital it was for your growth. And still, there was a longing to have Dad, one, notice me, approve of me, and want to spend time with me. And as I said, after much therapy, my softening and his opening up, we developed a closer relationship in my 30s and 40s. I became able to respond more as a fellow human being, and not only as his son. To get away from just those roles, to be present, and not just stuck in the past. The power of now. That allowed peace in me and between us, and joy to emerge in the time that remained. I now value qualities I got from each father, and realize I needed both of them on my unique journey of life. So, why, you might be asking, am I telling you about my life with my two fathers? Because as I rewrote my story, I came to peace. And that may have allowed me to see and experience God differently as well. To not need God to be an it, for example, to be quite comfortable with the notion of God as Father. It freed me in that way. I am aware, quite aware, that for many, perhaps if not most people, traditional fatherhood has been their experience and has provided many things like security and humor, but perhaps a very narrow emotional palette and tone. Many others had no father at all in their life, and that notion conjures abandonment and absence. If any of that reflects your experience, stay tuned. This gets interesting. The straitjacket of fatherhood and masculinity goes way back. Fathers in ancient Jewish culture were expected to be stern and studious and in control. They had absolute authority over their household and were thus referred to as Lord or Master. At one time, they could literally put children to death or sell them into slavery. You can read about that in the Bible. This level of absolute power over their realm provided then a useful metaphor for God, who had absolute authority over his children. So the Hebrew Bible consistently posits God as a man, as our Father. And remember, too, before science, before modern times, the common belief was that life came from men and that women were the incubators, so to speak. They didn't know about eggs, right? It was just the life is in the man and the woman holds it. So similarly, God would create life and place it onto Mother Earth, the holder of life, the womb where life matures. Those were the concepts and those were the roles. Jesus came into that specific world and taught people who were raised with those views of fatherhood and God. But what I find amazing is what he did with all of that to radically reimagine it. He, too, refers to God as a father figure, but one word he used was Abba, or Abba. And a better translation for that, according to many linguists, is daddy. It's not the only word he uses, but I find it enlightening that he used it at all. Now, what we might ask, was Jesus' experience with his earthly dad? And how might that have influenced him and his theology? Consider this. Neither Mary nor Joseph is mentioned in any of Paul's letters, the earliest written documents in the New Testament. In Mark, the first gospel written, Jesus' mother is barely mentioned, and there's no mention of Joseph. And now compare these two similar verses. When referring to Jesus, Mark 6:3 says, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?" But Matthew 13:55 says, "Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary?" Did you catch it? The late Episcopal bishop, John Shelby Spong, believed that Joseph was an invention by Matthew, echoed by Luke for literary and important symbolic purposes. So it's quite possible that Jesus grew up fatherless. Even traditionalists who do believe in a literal Joseph often explain his absence from the rest of the story by suggesting that Joseph was old and died early in Jesus' life. Well, that recontextualizes all of his references to God as Father. It was perhaps someone he longed for, a dreamlike figure, an idealized dad who is thrilled that you exist. This was a perfect metaphor for God, like the father in the prodigal son, who is so happy to see his son returning that he runs toward him. Please understand, men back then didn't run. It was undignified. But this father is overcome by his love and can't help himself. You can almost hear the crowds gasping at this new vision of who God could be. Neither the stern Jewish father figure nor the absent dad, but a fully present and overwhelmingly loving one. Can we perhaps reimagine God as comforter, as loving, as strong and generous, and everything we might want from a dad? Remember that stat from earlier, how many people, even today, feel estranged from their father, and you begin to understand the power of this framing. Look at the picture of God that Jesus paints for us and the life he suggests we live. In John 15, verse 9, as translated in the Message, Jesus says, "I've loved you the way my Father has loved me. Make yourselves at home in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain intimately at home in my love. That's what I've done, kept my Father's commands and made myself at home in his love. I've told you these things for a purpose, that my joy might be your joy, and your joy wholly mature. This is my command. Love one another the way I loved you. This is the very best way to love. Now, that is a different view of God and of what's important for all of us, including men. This is not all about anger and domination and winning, proving ourselves, or any of the other problematic things we might traditionally associate with manhood. And remember the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells people to love their enemies, to forgive their brother, to practice radical non-violence, and love wastefully, as Bishop Spong put it. After all of that, toward the end of Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew 25, he tells his disciples that the way into heaven, into the kingdom that they long to inhabit, is to treat everyone the way you'd treat him, even as you treat the least of these, right? To see everyone as him and treat them accordingly. Imagine treating everyone like you'd treat Jesus. So everyone back then is thinking the kingdom is going to be a military victory over the Romans, the Messiah conquering the oppressors. And he says, no. It's here and now and about radical love. Acting like the best God you can imagine. It's about relationship. And it's full of joy. Do we have another mic?
Actually, no. This one just died.
Okay, it just turned red. It's working for now. Joy. What Jesus suggests is intimate stuff, the kind of things you don't see much in stories for men. He offered a radically, what you might call, non-patriarchal treatise, a paradigm shift away from the typical male take on everything. I think he's a way shower for how to be fully alive, how to be an amazing person, and yes, how to be an awesome man. Women, back then, were funding his ministry. They were the first to see him at the tomb. So clearly he valued women, way ahead of his time. I think he knew even then that we had a special challenge with men and getting us to embrace love. So Jesus artfully took the concept of God as stern and powerful Father and reimagined God and power itself as endless love and intimacy. He artfully took the concept of the kingdom of God and the military conquest of territory and reimagined it as a radically new state of being, with radical love and generosity and forgiveness and non-violence as the way in. One of the reasons I have not spoken today about God the Mother is I don't want to let men off the hook. As if to say, caring and nurturing and emotions are the realm of mom. I want to live into a world with a broader expression for men, where we can imagine those qualities as essential elements of ourselves and of our God. And I hope and trust that women, even after some of the things we've done, want all of that for us as well. Because then we are better fathers and partners, better collaborators and listeners and citizens. We can reimagine what fatherhood is, what masculinity is, and what God can be. I've spoken today about God the Father, and I hope those words mean more to you now than they did before. Eventually, perhaps, the words become less important than the experience of our oneness, a vital embrace of the whole human family, children, mother, and father. And as we move into our full humanity, and therefore into a more joyful expression of our unity, together we know we thrive. Thank you. Thank you, God. And so it is. Amen.